Everybody to get from street.
Hey, Mom!
Radio Free Innsmouth episode 301. It's that time of year again where it gets cold outside and you gotta put on some black metal. And this time around we're gonna be talking about one of the coldest sounding bands of all time.
Freeze. 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 Cool party.
In fact, they are so cold that they are from Russia, and not just any old part of Russia, but Murmansk, which I believe makes them super duper Russian.
Я не отдам хлеб! Я каменщик, работаю 3 дня! Без зарплаты!
Because you really can't get farther north than Murmansk Oblast, the city of Murmansk, which is the largest urban area north of the Arctic Circle in terms of population. It's also directly north of Karelia, that area of the world that Russia and Finland have been doing the bit over for a long ass time. Point is, it's really cold, it's really dark, and it's a good place to mix some black metal in, especially if your band name is Old Wainds, because you're really good at it, as you're about to find out over the course of this episode. Old Wainds, just about tied with Black Death for the biggest 90s Russian black metal band to not either be part of Blazebirth Hall or the Far Eastern Black Wolves, whom I covered on episodes 84 and 199 respectively. When it comes to Old Wainds, if they were to sound like one or other of those scenes, I guess you could say they sound a little Blazebirth Hall-ish, particularly on their early material, and indeed, their first album was re-released in 2000 by Stellar Winter Records, the label that's owned by the guy from Temnozor. But more than anything...
No, we are of course Norwegians.
Norwegians?
Yeah, they're very Norse sounding. They definitely listen to all the Burzums and the Gorgoroths and whatnot. But there's two bands in particular that form a vital component of Old Wainds' sound. And specifically the things that they take from these bands I find to be somewhat of interest in and of themselves. The first of these bands being good old-fashioned...
som klarte seg veldig fint på 70-tallet uten den dritten.
Darkthrone. Specifically Darkthrone circa Transylvanian Hunger. According to Fenris himself, this album was the peak of Darkthrone's insanity. And from that, Old Wainds took a similar sense of aesthetic monomania. I mean, this riff right here has been basically one drone note, very monochromatic and grayscale. But the interesting thing about that sort of monomania is when the music does shift, it feels like a much more significant change in the scope of the music. Like normally this would be any other black thrash riff, but the fact that it comes after all of that obsessive droning really calls attention to the shift. The other band that Old Wainds took a whole lot from was good old Immortal, but again, it's a very specific era of Immortal. We're not talking about that goofy, cuddly, jokey,
end up in jail
Immortal that nowadays people might be familiar with. We're talking about Immortal at their meanest, nastiest, and most brutal. Battles in the North, which is actually somewhat similar to Transylvanian Hunger, that it also indulges in a bit of aesthetic monomania, but instead of focusing on droning ambience and darkness, the emphasis is on being as cold and unrelenting as possible. When you take those two ideas, put forth by Transylvanian Hunger and Battles in the North, you add to that a peculiarly Russian Blazebirth Hall method of constructing these very furtive sounding melodies, and you get the first Old Wainds album, Where the Snows Are Never Gone. See right there, first riff on the album combines that monochromatic dark sound of Darkthrone with the unrelenting brutality of Immortal. To top it all off, the main melody sounds like something you might hear on a Branicold album, just considerably more deranged and alienated. And speaking of deranged alienation, those vocals, some of the nastiest ever. And like Darkthrone, the music is so unrelenting in its focus that whenever it does shift up, it feels like a pretty major tectonic moving of continental plates. A lot of this album is just about really grinding into these musical phrases, coming to a full stop for a slight sense of reprieve, going into the next nastiness. But they do throw in some tempo changes here and there. This is definitely a band with a strong sense of compositional dynamics and drama. And much like Darkthrone, because the music is so monochromatic, when it does shift, it feels extra dramatic. It feels like it's a very significant thing happening.
It will be significant.
Now might be a good time to warn the listener that this shit is not black metal for beginners. If you're new to the genre, you probably don't want to start with this album. It might scare you off. But hey, black metal is supposed to be somewhat disturbing and insane. So for me, this is a really good black metal album. Here's a really good example of that distinctly Russian style of black metal melody. Again, very much sounds like something you might hear on a Brana Called or Forest album, just with a much more deranged sounding vocal performance on top of it. But it hits a lot of those same emotional notes of combined triumph and melancholy, with these waves of emotionality cresting over this chaotic sea of harsh black metal noise. Again, it's definitely not for everybody. For this style of black metal, Old Wainds is particularly good at conveying such emotion. And again, with those compositional dynamics, the seismic shifts. Check this bit out. That little glissando slide down the string into the drum fill, very Darkthrone. And from Immortal, we get that icy, unrelenting black metal assault and battery nastiness. They really came out of the gate swinging with this one. Incredibly solid black metal debut, and I could see why for quite a few people this might be the best Old Wainds album. It also established something of a tradition for this band in that it has one longer, more doom metal inflected song on it, dipping a little bit more into the Burzum side of Norse black metal. What does that sound like when Old Wainds does it?
Let's find out.
Interestingly enough, it ends up sounding a whole lot like Judas Iscariot to my ears. A lot of that same sort of gradual melody arising from moving around inside these minor bar chords. It's a horizontal motion across the guitar neck in addition to moving up and down. I'm also a big fan of these melancholic, wordless, clean vocals. Definitely the most haunting moment of the album for me, and probably my favorite song on it, even if it's way different than all the other material on the album. Probably a little too slow and subtle for some people. But for me, it hits just right, showing all these post-black metal bands how to do slow and atmospheric properly. Wouldn't you know it, the song even has a really cool second section where they totally change stuff up and get surprisingly kind of punky, I guess? Almost sounds like them doing Absurd or something like that. Very groove-laden and rocking, and yet still entirely keeping with the atmosphere of this album overall. Well done stuff. And again, the change is given that extra significance because all the music before it was so monochromatic. This first stylistic era of Old Wainds continued with their 1999 split EP with Nav entitled We Are the North. For me, this might be my favorite Old Wainds release. It sees them stepping out of the shadow of Blaze Birth Hall entirely to give birth to something new and unique. Despite aesthetic commonalities, this stuff doesn't sound like anybody but Old Wainds. And that's not just because of the vocals this time around. That guitar riff doesn't sound like anybody else. And the change-ups on this EP are even more startling. Look at this resonant cascade of minor key melodies.
No! I'm with the science team!
I really like the right channel guitar just hitting that do-do-do-do-do-do, while the left channel guitar just goes crazy with the arpeggiation. And this really violent transition back into the more intense riffing. That's pretty darn cool.
Stay cool, bird boy.
The music on this EP moves a little bit faster in terms of the change-ups than Where the Snows Are Never Gone did. But again, you could tell it's still the same band doing all this. And the doom sections on this hit like a fucking truck.
어플로 주문하던가?
Yeah, or a snowplow. I mean, this fucking funeral march we got going on right here, that's some heavy shit. And the section that comes after it, man, you're not gonna believe this. As the chords unravel, we go completely off the rails. With this shimmering, icy wall of sound. Again, these riffing styles, pretty darn unique to Old Wainds, and they're very arresting in their sonic majesty. But speaking of the fact that this was a split EP, we should probably talk about the other band on it, Nav. Because the main guy in Nav, Izbor, was Old Wainds' drummer since the beginning, even though they didn't announce him as an official member of the band until like 2013 or something, kind of weird. And if you like Old Wainds, specifically this era of Old Wainds, you're gonna like Nav. Nav in Russian means the world of the dead in Old Slavic mythology. And appropriately, Nav kind of sounds like a nastier, more concise version of Old Wainds. He leans a little bit more heavily into the Immortal and less into the Darkthrone. And overall, this tends to be a little bit more hostile and aggressive and less majestic and melancholic. But I gotta think, if you're into Old Wainds, you're gonna like Nav. It's got a lot of the same sort of shimmery, icy kind of melodic riffs, just in a far more chaotic fashion, to the point where it almost borders on being war metal at But more than anything, it's mostly just immortal worship. But immortal worship done very well, and in a particular aesthetic idiom that would appeal to fans of bands like Old Wainds. Morok from Old Wainds and Isbor from Nav also joined some other guys around this time, the mid to late 90s, for a death metal band called Full Decay that I'd never see mentioned anywhere, and honestly, they're pretty interesting for establishing a rather uniquely Russian style of death metal that has hints of their black metal backgrounds in it if you listen for them. Despite that, it's not the kind of death metal you'd expect black metal people to make. It's very thuggish. It's percussive almost in a New York death metal way, but the grooves themselves are off-kilter and strange, where it doesn't really sound like anybody else except maybe Definition Sane from the Ukraine, who are also a weird death metal side project of black metal people. In that case, it was Lucifugium. But occasionally it does pick up and start to slot in some more melody, and you're like, okay, I could see that people involved in this band were probably around for the Old Wainds stuff. I mean, check out this layering. A little bit of black metal style harmonization going on in the death metal never hurt nobody. And much like Old Wainds, they also do occasionally incorporate a hint of doom to the proceedings. And check out that bass tone, cool as fuck. With some proper chunky death metal mixed in. Almost kind of American sounding. Whatever it is, it's as decidedly non-Scandinavian as Old Wainds was Scandinavian sounding. About the only thing you could give it as far as sounding Scandinavian is this was definitely influenced by Autopsy, and death metal era Darkthrone was influenced by Autopsy, so I guess there's that.
Look, big sunglasses, not emperor sunglasses, big.
From the other side of the world, we got some South American sounding war metal riff. But after the New York death metal style full stop drumstick click, they start overlaying those black metal harmonies again. It's sort of a sinister, almost black metal-y kind of style. Whatever it is, I think it's cool as hell, and Full Decay is definitely worth the listen, even if you're not a black metal guy. It's damn good death metal.
That's what's most definitely up.
And I never see anybody say anything about these guys. But back to Old Wainds proper, enough with the side projects and ancillary bands. Old Wainds kind of exists in two eras for me. The first era would be the Where the Snows Are Never Gone album and the We Are the North full length. Second era is basically all their other full length albums because there was a pretty noticeable style change. That said, the later stuff is also great. My favorite out of all their later albums would have to be Scalding Coldness from 2005, which was actually the first Old Wainds I ever heard, and probably the first ever Russian black metal I heard. Mostly because Jeff Tandy from the band Averse Sephira, whom I covered on episode 288, mentioned them in an interview as being one of his favorites due to how sick the vocals were. He put them right up there alongside Antiochus's Cut Your Flesh and Worship Satan and 1349's Hellfire, and I thought at the time Antiochus was pretty neat, still like them, and 1349 Hellfire, awesome albums, so I had to check this shit out. Hell yeah! You'll notice pretty much all the Darkthrone sort of ambience is gone, but the shimmering riffs that were creeping in on the We Are the North EP are definitely fully flowered this time around. Production's also a lot cleaner and more digital, which I think works for the cold sound they're going for, and still sounds suitably dehumanized. Very icy, frosty, and sharp. Also returning from the first era are the really well done transition parts leading into massive shifts within the music. And there's even a little bit of, some kind of Full Decay style chunky death metal if you really, really listen for it. And a wee bit of Darkthrone style glissando. I don't know, maybe it's just because I listened to all these albums back to back to back when I was getting this episode ready, but I feel like despite the change in sound, there's a real sense of stylistic cohesion to Old Wainds' journey as musicians. You can hear elements of stuff from all over the place resurfacing on each and every one of them. It all makes sense. And speaking of such a resurgence, they gotta jump back into that fast, nasty black metal that they're always so good at. And this is a particularly good example of it.
Yeah, baby!
That's that ice-cold goodness people come to Old Wainds for. Remember earlier, I mentioned they established a tradition of having a slower, kind of slightly stylistically differentiated song on every album. Well, guess what? This one closes the album out with such a track. And much like the slower song Where the Snows Are Never Gone, Scalding Coldness' differentiated track leans heavily on the Burzum, even incorporating some very Vargas synths, as well as some suitably dramatic narration. But this time when the song speeds up, instead of going all punky and absurd-like, it leans hard into sort of an ambient trance-like black metal sound. With very long, melodically involved, winding kind of riffs, extended musical phrases, and again, a whole lot of sorrowful and wrathful emotions coexisting. Okay, this part right here, you can tell it's another amazing build-up to another one of those awesome black metal screams.
Yeah, baby!
Along with Société de Glace and Old School Immortal, you really can't beat Old Wainds as far as just a almost spiritual reverence for winter as a concept. And I think if you like black metal and you've been around in the genre for a while, you probably owe it to yourself to check their discography out. Whatever you choose to do, thanks for listening or watching, whatever you did. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
They must have both, either now or too late. This is your island and it's your responsibility. You help us get both quickly, otherwise there is World War III and everybody is blaming you.